Powell about his book, 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away. So I will first introduce David and then introduce his book. How many of you have read the book already? Okay, cool. So I'll introduce the book a bit too. And then Dave and I will get into a bit of an interview, and then everyone here, if you have any questions, you can ask David. So a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and the Columbia Journalism School, David Powell began his professional life as a reporter with the Associated Press in New York, Miami, and Tallahassee. After earning a law degree from Florida State University, he practiced law for 30 years throughout the state. In his work and through civic organizations, he met many Cuban Americans and was moved by the stories of their lives. He began recording interviews about their memories in 2016, first in Florida and then elsewhere. In 2021, the University of Miami acquired his interview recordings, transcripts, and work papers for its Cuban Heritage Collection. 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away, Memories of Early Cuban Exiles is his first book, and he and his wife live in Tallahassee. So now a bit about the book. Bringing together an unprecedented number of extensive personal stories, this oral history book shares the triumphs and heartbreaking moments experienced by some of the first Cubans to come to the United States after Castro took power in 1959. 90 Miles and a Lifetime Away, Memories of Early Cuban Exiles is a moving look inside 15 years of migration that changed the two countries and the lives of those who found themselves separated from their homeland. So David conducted extensive interviews with 54 people and uses extensive passages from those oral histories to tell the story of the Cuban refugees who came in two massive waves from 1959 to 1973. More than 600,000 Cubans migrated to the U.S. during those years, some by way of other countries and most arriving in Miami with only a few clothes and pocket money. Most came without visas, but the government let them enter the country anyway. So Powell's Cuban American narrators remembered Cuba as it was before the revolution and what they lost when their families decided to leave the island. In their own words, exiles describe why they left, how they prepared for departure, and what they left behind. Some of them describe their arrival in the U.S. as my second birthday and say their experience in this country was tantamount to rebirth. To assist them, the U.S. government created the most generous refugee assistance program in the nation's history, transforming the exiles' lives in America as well. They became one of the most rapidly successful immigrant groups in U.S. history. This story shows ordinary people caught in a struggle against powerful historical forces over which they have no control. It portrays America at its best, not perfect, but as the land of refuge and opportunity that it has always been for oppressed people from around the world. It proves that our government can manage the immigration crisis at the southern border effectively and humanely if our leaders choose to do so. And it shows how refugees will strengthen America if we let them. It's an important story to keep in mind as we are all called to address the refugee crisis of our own time. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Thanks
for the opportunity to be here, and thanks to all of you for coming out in the heat of the day to hear about my book and to participate in the conversation.
So will you first tell us what got you interested in writing this story to begin with?
Well, the principal motivator was that I had, over the years I've lived in Florida, which goes back to 1975, I had met many Cuban Americans. Some of whom I didn't know were Cuban Americans because I was brought up to believe that in this country you don't ask somebody where did you and your family come from. And so there are a number of people who are in the book that I only found out they were Cuban Americans and they had come from Cuba after I really got into the project. But all the ones that I have known, have worked with and met through civic organizations, but I've really stopped to talk to them and ask for their story, ask how they and their families came to be here, what they had experienced. I always found it extremely moving, and it really gave me an appreciation for the idea that many of them mention in their interviews, which is those of us who were lucky enough to be born in this country don't have the same appreciation for it that people who were born elsewhere have for it. And I encountered that over and over and over in my interviews. But when I started, I was drawn to the fact that this was ordinary people caught in this epic struggle between the free world and communism during the Cold War. And yet, the deeper I got into it, I began to see other facets of the story that I thought were important. The fact that it shows us to be what we've always been, which is a land of opportunity and a land of refuge. So those were the kinds of things that I kept discovering, if you will, as I got deeper and deeper into the project, that really kept me motivated and kept me working on the book.
Right. And how did you select the people that you wound up focusing on?
Well, I started with friends, and then friends of friends, and then friends of friends of friends. There was nothing scientific about it. This is not like a statistically valid representative sample like you would get in a opinion survey. I had to basically work from existing relationships that I had. One woman who's in the book, who has a unique story, it turned out, was the friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of my wife. I mean, that's how attenuated it became.
Basically a stranger.
Oh, no question about that. Most of the people in the book were strangers to me when I asked them for interviews, which was really quite interesting because I'd say four out of five people that I asked for an interview after I found out enough about them to know whether I wanted their story, they said yes, and that frankly surprised me. But I kept track of the characteristics of the people that I interviewed as I went along, because I wanted to make sure I had a group that was broadly representative of the 600,000 that came over. So I kept track of men and women. I kept track of first wave, second wave. I kept track of people from Havana and people from elsewhere in Cuba, people who settled in Miami, people who settled elsewhere. I mean, there was a whole set of characteristics that I kept track of as I was doing the interviews, so that I could make sure that I had, as best as I could get, a broad cross-section of the people who came over during that period.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you insert yourself into the narrative?
Well, originally I wasn't going to. Originally I was going to just include excerpts from the interviews that I did. And the interviews were quite extensive. I mean, the typical interview lasted 2 hours and got into, as you can imagine, some of the most traumatic and emotional experiences in my narrators' lives and in their families' lives. But I kept going, and I initially thought that I would just take excerpts from the interviews and put them together and use that to tell the story. But when I first started writing up a sample chapter for purposes of pitching literary agents and publishers, it quickly became apparent that that simply didn't work, because the reader would not know what the historic context was for the story that my narrator was getting ready to tell. And so that was when I hit upon the format of the book, which is, you know, these excerpts from the interviews, and interspersed among them are 2-3 paragraphs of third-person narrative describing what's going on at that particular time, either in Cuba or in the United States, the background for the story that a person is getting ready to tell.
Mm-hmm. And then will you tell us a little bit about what your interviewees had in common? Was there a through line from their stories?
There were a couple. They were pretty obvious, but there was this great, well, one thing they all said was, there's nothing unusual about my story. And that, of course, is just not so. Everybody's story is unique. I mean, I had that idea when I got into the project, and so they would always say that, and I'd politely acknowledge it, but I never believed it. But there were a couple of obvious things. I mean, there was this great appreciation for the people who had gotten them out in the period that they came out, which was in the formative years of the revolution, 59 to 73, and a very difficult period. I mean, Cuba has difficult periods all the time. They're in one now. But great appreciation for the people that got them out. Typically parents and relatives, but not always. And I think for many of them, that was the principal motivation to tell me their story. It was a way for them to make sure that what their parents had done would be remembered. And it was their way of paying tribute to what their parents did. And they talked about that, they acknowledged it. The other obvious thing is their love for this country. Now, this country took them in, and through a refugee assistance program, unlike any other that we've had in this country, made it possible for them to succeed as rapidly as they did as a group. Made it possible for many of them to go to college. The government's refugee assistance program for the Cubans included low-cost college loans. You had to be a Cuban national, and if you could get one, you could get a loan for $1,000 a year, which doesn't sound like much these days, but in those days, in the mid-60s, that would cover from 1/3 to all of the college tuition for somebody going to college in this country, depending upon whether it was a private or a public school. So just this reservoir of love and goodwill for this country that was really, really striking.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if during your interviews you discussed our current immigration crisis.
That didn't come up often. It came up a few times. And there was a division of opinion from the few people that got into that. Some of them were, and this was all going on, in 2016 to 2020 when Donald Trump was president and was pursuing a very different immigration policy than President Biden is, or than President Obama did. And it was a very divided opinion from the few who got into it. Some of them basically were appalled by what the government was doing during that period. A number of them said, I couldn't get in today if the policies that our government is following were in place when my family came over. I couldn't get in. Others were of the view that those restrictions and the actions that President Trump took were justified, and that people who were coming over without the required visas shouldn't be let in. What they never acknowledged was most of the Cubans who came over from 59 to 73 didn't have visas either. And the government let them in anyway on parole. But there were some who felt very strongly on one side and others who felt very strongly on the other side. And I didn't ask about those things. I did ask a couple of times about what my subjects thought about President Obama's steps to try to restore normal diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. There was a division of opinion on that, but I'd say the predominant view was the people I interviewed were against it. And that's consistent with what you find when you look at the opinion surveys of Cuban Americans, which are conducted periodically by Florida International University in Miami. Every 2 or 3 years they'll conduct the Cuba poll, which polls Cuban Americans who live in Miami-Dade County about a range of current issues. There's usually a division of opinion that's not in keeping with the stereotype that many people have of the Cuban community as being lopsided in their feelings one way or the other on particular issues. But I would say that the predominant view from those who expressed an opinion in the interviews that we did, they didn't agree with what President Obama was trying to do.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the two waves differ from one another and why?
The first wave was from 1959 to 1962. It was decidedly upper and middle class. I mean, more than a third of the people who came over in that first 3-year period were from had professional, semi-professional, or managerial occupations. Many of them were, if you will, Americanized. They had been educated in this country, or they did work for American corporations, because before the revolution, there were very strong ties between the United States and Cuba. And particularly at the middle and upper class level, there was a lot of social and business and cultural interaction between the two countries. So a lot of the people who came over in the first wave were people who had very strong ties to the United States. They either worked for American companies, or they came here on vacation. The second wave, which came from 1965 to 1973, was different. It was more working class. In fact, 2/3 of the people who came over then were classified by intake officers for the government here as students, children, or in the term of the time, housewives. So it was a decidedly, and it was predominantly more working class. So it was a very different characteristic. The interesting connection between the two is that in order to come over from 65 to 73 on the freedom flights that President Johnson set up, the government chartered airliners that brought Cuban refugees here twice a day, 5 days a week, month after month from 65 to 73. To get a seat on those planes, you were supposed to have a relative in this country who claimed you. It was essentially saying, my sister, my brother, my son, my father is still in Cuba, and I want them to come here. They want to come, and I want to be in some degree responsible for their coming here and what happens to them when they get here. So you really had to have a connection in this country to get a seat on the freedom flight in that second wave. One of the consequences of that, of course, was there were hardly any, and it's like 1% or 2%, who were Afro-Cubans. Black Cubans simply did not come over in the first wave any more than maybe, I think it was 1%, because this was still a segregated society, particularly in Florida. We were still living under Jim Crow. And they knew it. They knew what it meant because they knew enough about the States, and they had seen what some American companies had done when they were operating in Cuba.
So they chose not to come.
They chose not to come. In fact, a number of people I interviewed had domestic employees in their households that were very well to do, and they had domestic workers in their house, and they wanted to bring them over. And they talked about, as they were telling me their story, and it's in the book, their domestic helper said, we're not going to the United States. We know what life is like for people of color here. And so they didn't come. Consequently, in the second wave, when you had to have a relative here to sponsor you, Afro-Cubans didn't really have anybody because so few of them had come in the first wave.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research? So obviously you interviewed all these people, but what about your secondary sources?
Well, when I began in April of 2015. I had come up with the idea for the book some years before, but I put it off because of my law practice. But 2015, I began doing what we lawyers call due diligence. I began trying to investigate the story, make sure I understood it, try to game out what would the project look like. I mean, I came up with a chapter outline for what the book would be, and the book is pretty close to it. Because the one thing I didn't want to do was I didn't want to start interviewing people and get them to tell me these emotional, revealing stories about their lives and not finish the project and have to basically shelve it at some point because I had not understood some potential obstacle. So I did all that for about a year and a half, and then I began interviewing in November of 2016, and that really was kind of where the rubber met the road. I thought initially, that the interviews would be more than enough to do the book, but what I discovered when I realized that I had to do more than just take excerpts from the interviews for the text of the book, that I had to provide some third-person historical narrative. I got serious again about reading secondary sources, about doing archival research. University of Miami Cuban Heritage Collection is a fabulous resource. Did a lot of work there. Did a lot of work at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library in Austin. I spent several weeks there. At the time, we actually owned a second home there because I'm originally from there. But it made it very easy to go to the LBJ Library and look up what they had in their files. And they had a lot of stuff. I mean, I found some great stuff both there and at the University of Miami. So it was a combination of new primary source material from my interviews and a lot of secondary source material, both from things that I read and just from documentation that I found in these archives.
So before we began, the two of us were talking a bit about a compelling person from your book. Do you want to do a bit of that reading and explain?
Yeah, I do. There was one of the first people I interviewed was a woman in Austin, Texas, named Mercedes Vangamer Pena. And I had been introduced to her through mutual friends many years ago, and I knew she was Cuban, but I didn't remember anything about her story. So when I started working on the book, I got in touch with mutual friends in Austin. I said, here's what I'm doing. I really want to interview her. Would you approach her and see if she's willing to do it? Well, she was. So on a trip to Austin, I went and interviewed her. This would have been probably December of 2016. She was like the fourth person I interviewed. And her story far surpassed anything that I had anticipated. Her father had been killed in the 1957 attempt to assassinate the dictator Batista. She had come to the States with her mother. She had come over when her mother was already here. Then in 1979, she moved back to Cuba. She went back to Cuba with her two sons because, as she says in the book, she says, I discovered I had pieces of my identity that were missing. She'd been uprooted at the age of 10. She was not the only person to tell me about that. There's several people in the book who tell that. But one of the more interesting passages from her interview is about when they first came to Miami. She first joined her mother and her stepfather in Miami. And it reflects on a theme that came up in the very first interview I did and then recurred over and over as I was talking to people and interviewing. And that was the affinity that Jews in this country had for the Cubans. Over and over again, the Cubans that I interviewed talked about how they had been befriended or helped by Jews in this country. As one of my narrators said, 1960 was not that far away from 1940, and when they saw us coming, it was something they could relate to. And I heard that over and over. But then this is the story that Mercedes told that's along that theme. We moved to Miami Beach right away. We were the first Cubans in our building. Everybody else was Jewish, from New York or Eastern Europe, a lot of Holocaust survivors. They knew what we were going through, for God's sake, especially the concentration camp survivors. And there were a lot of them in that building. They missed their grandkids. So I had 50 grandparents. My sister and I were the only kids in this building of wonderful old Jews. There was one gorgeous old lady, Mrs. Rosenberg. She was very skinny. She had white roots, black hair. She wore spaghetti strap dresses with falsies and pumps with no back to them, big skirts and makeup. She always wore multi-bracelets, bangles on both sides. She spoke with a German accent. She really befriended me. During the Bay of Pigs invasion, my stepfather was fighting, and my uncle was fighting on the other side. And even though my grandfather was not fighting, he was right there. I was incredibly hyper and very sad. There were these candies called C. Howard's Violet Mints, and I loved them. She said, let's go get some little violets. When she was paying, she did something and her bracelets moved. I saw the numbers on her wrist, and I froze. I knew what it meant. I asked her if the Nazis had done that to her. She was very upfront. She said yes. Then she told me. And the reason I'm here is because every time something horrendous happened, I always put myself in some wonderful place. A beautiful moment that I had had before. Some sweet and emotional moment in her life. I want you to remember that. That's all she said. She was telling me how she survived, and boy, did it come in handy.
That's so beautiful.
So she and so many of them have stories like that just absolutely take your breath away. And make you feel like you're right there. As we were talking about earlier, oral history, we forget sometimes that history is lived by real people like you and me. And that's what's in this book, is stories from real people who lived through that whole story.
Would you mind talking about the reaction of the people were in this book upon reading their stories in print?
Yeah, they've been very very complimentary. They've been very pleased. One woman who's in the book, who I've known for a number of years, had me over to her house to sign some books that she was sending to relatives, and we were chatting for a while, and she said, I got your book, and the first thing I did was read my parts in it. And I knew they were going to do that, so I made sure the index included the pages where everybody's testimonies were located. But Deanna said, so I sat down and I read those, and then I cried for 4 hours. I just sat on the couch and I cried for 4 hours because it just all came back to me. She said my husband couldn't understand why I was sitting there crying, but it all came back to me. And a number of them have, not quite that graphically, have essentially said the same thing, that it brought back a lot of memories that they didn't realize were as sensitive as they turned out to be.
And speaking of memories, there are 20 photos in your book. Can you tell us how you selected those photos?
Yeah, I wanted well, first of all, I was limited in the number of photos that I could pick. Just as I was limited in the number of words that were supposed to be in the manuscript. It's how publishers make the business decision to publish a book. They come up with certain criteria. But they said I could have 20 black and white photographs. And as the interviewing process was going along, I had taken a little portable scanner with me when I would do interviews, and had asked in advance, if you got any photographs from that period, would you mind if I scanned them for use in the book? They were all very remarkably forthcoming. A lot of them kind of rooted around in the attic, looking for old photographs or old documents. Like I've got report cards from Cuban schools. I mean, just all kinds of memorabilia. And what I ended up deciding was the most important thing to me, and photographs from Cuba and photographs from after they got here. And what I ultimately decided was best, from my point of view, was to pick one photo from as many different people as I could, 20 people, and pick it from the period before they came over, so that we could see who these people were, who their families were, their parents, brothers and sisters, what kind of things they were doing. There's a photograph of a woman who became a fairly prominent art historian in Miami, Mary Jean VR, and the photograph of her is at a school carnival where they're all dressed up like cowboys, the American influence that was so prevalent in Cuba at that time. So that's how I picked it. I wanted people to take a look at the photographs and to try to have an understanding of who these people were and how very much like us they were during that period of their lives.
What questions do all of you have? Does anybody have any?
Yes, ma'am.
When all of those flights were bringing so many people here, they were able to leave Cuba without any difficulty? Nobody was stopping them from getting on the flights?
No, what happened was, and it was something that I never knew. I mean, I discovered or rediscovered so much about the larger story in the course of doing the book. I had completely, I must admit, forgotten about the freedom flights.
I didn't even know about it.
I'd forgotten about it. I knew about them because they were just finished when I moved to Miami in 1975. But essentially what happened was 1965, Fidel Castro decides he wants to become a champion of emerging countries, particularly in Africa, who were trying to get out of the colonial era. And his argument is, well, that's what we just did by kicking the U.S. out of Cuba. And there was, frankly, in my view, there was some justification for that attitude. I'm not saying the means by which it was done were good, but I understood that point of view from my readings. And so, but by that point, 65, conditions were so bad in Cuba that people were getting in rowboats, getting on inner tubes, crossing the Florida Straits, crossing the Yucatan Channel, doing anything to get out. 70 to 200 a month were escaping. And of course, the publicity for Castro was terrible. I mean, he's creating this paradise, and people are doing anything they can to get out. And how does that make him look in places like Africa? So he decides, and my book includes some very interesting background stories about how it came about. He decides and gets up suddenly and announces in September of 1965, if you want to go to the U.S., you can go. Your relatives in the U.S. can come pick you up at a little village called Camarioca. They can bring a boat over and pick them up, and you go there and we'll let you go. No problem. Well, of course, this was the forerunner of the Mario boat lift in 1980. It's the same deal. Go to this port, your relatives can come get you, you're free to go. President Johnson, of course, realized that this was a propaganda ploy, because up until that point, we were not allowing Cubans to come into this country. We had this strict isolation policy. And so what President Johnson did was he said, we will welcome you. You are welcome to come to the United States. He turned the tables on Castro from a propaganda point of view, if you will. But the boat lift was so chaotic that through the Swiss, Johnson was able to get a mediated agreement which set up the freedom flights. Johnson said, we will pay to send airliners to Cuba twice a day, 5 days a week, to bring Cuban refugees here. And Castro agreed to it. And so they set that up. Nobody expected it was going to take as long or bring as many people as it did. Nobody expected that at the time.
How long did it run?
It ran from 1965 to 1973.
Wow.
Yeah. So, so if you were in Cuba, what happened was, if you were in exile in the U.S., you went to the government and you said, I got a brother in Cuba. I want to sponsor them to come over. I want them here. I want to bring them here. If you were in Cuba and you were the brother, you went to the government and you said, I want an exit permit. In those years, you had to get a permit from the government to exit the country, to leave the country. It's like a visa. And the Swiss would match up the two lists and decided who had been claimed that wanted to come. And so what they did at that point was they had official lists that the Swiss said these are the lists that match, and the Cubans at that point got to decide when somebody left. They had a lottery, and as one of my narrators says, you listen to the radio every Saturday night to hear the lottery numbers for who gets to leave. In order to leave, however, you had to leave everything behind. You had to leave everything but a change of clothes or two, and they talk about that in here, and that's why so many of them, when they got here, they were essentially destitute. They had family, and they had this generous refugee assistance program, but in terms of their own resources, they had nothing or next to nothing, and that's how the freedom flights went until 1973. It got the number of people who registered for the freedom flights was so far beyond what Castro expected that in May of 1966 he said, "We're not taking any more names. We're not." He cut it off. But by that point, they had so many that it took until 1973 to get them all on planes and to bring them here.
So did everyone who signed up for that make it over? Is that why it stopped? That they just ran out of names, or?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that everyone who signed up, who had someone here claiming them, and had signed up by the cutoff, pretty much got to go. There was some disagreement at the time it ended as to whether there were more people who were eligible to come, but the government wouldn't let them leave. And then, of course, there were people that, and I mean the Cuban government, and then there were others that Johnson wanted all the political prisoners. They said, no, we're not trying to lose any political prisoners. They also said no, they would not allow certain people to leave, for example, young men who were draft age. They couldn't leave. So there were restrictions on who got to leave, but it was an amazing story. I mean, I can't imagine something like that happening in our time. I simply can't imagine. And yet, there was no controversy over it. People thought it was the right thing to do. It eventually became so expensive that the Congress said, we need to figure out how to put the brakes on this. And there were even attempts to cut off funding for the freedom flights. But our senators, Lawton Childs and Ed Gurney, a Republican and a Democrat, worked with the Nixon administration to protect funding for the freedom flights. And their argument was very simple. You know, anyone who signed up for the freedom flights got fired from their job because the government controlled all the employment. And you know what Childs and Gurney and the Nixon administration argued was, these people have signed up. They're relying on us to bring them over. They've already paid the price. They lost their jobs, and we have a moral obligation to follow up and to bring them here. And so that's what happened. Yes, ma'am.
Couple questions.
Sure.
You haven't mentioned travels to Cuba. Have you traveled to Cuba?
I have. I had wanted to go there for decades. Given the way our government's policies on that have been like a weather vane, it never worked out until April of this year.
Oh.
And so I went for a week in April with some friends and spent a week in Havana. We did one day trip out of town to the tobacco country in far western Cuba. But the rest of the time we were in Havana, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. It really was.
Also, I think in that first wave, there were hundreds, maybe thousands of young men, early teenagers, or even younger than that, who came to this country by themselves, their parents.
Yeah.
They call them maybe the Lost Boys or something?
Operation Pedro Pan, I think, is what you're referring to.
Yes, Peter Pan.
I did, and frankly, that was a challenge because there's been a lot written about Pedro Pan, a lot of books, some of which I read. And so the writing challenge for me was it's probably the best remembered episode from that whole period, and it's a great story in and of itself. But it's been written about so many times. It was kind of a challenge to figure out how to include it in my book. I couldn't ignore it.
So none of the people you interviewed?
No. I interviewed a number of people. I interviewed a number of people who came over through Operation Pedro Pan, and I interviewed a number of other people who came over outside Operation Pedro Pan. There were a lot of Cuban parents who were not using the church to bring their kids over. Operation Pedro Pan was a joint operation of the Catholic Church and the United States government. The government surreptitiously ended up paying the airfare for these unaccompanied Cuban children to come over. The Catholic Church said they would assume responsibility for them, and that generous refugee assistance program by President Kennedy included a component that reimbursed the providers of care for unaccompanied Cuban children who came to the U.S. First time the U.S. government had ever assumed responsibility for unaccompanied children who showed up at our border. It never happened before. 14,000 came through Operation Pedro Pan. 8,000 of them were taken in by the Catholic Church and other religious providers, but mostly the Catholic Church, since it was mostly Catholic families that were sending their children over. But 6,000 of the 14 were met at the Miami airport by friends or relatives who took them home. So it was this very interesting blend of experiences that they had. Some of the ones who ended up in the care of the church ended up, one woman tells stories about being in an orphanage in Buffalo. They all have different stories that they tell, and I included those in the book, trying to representatively reflect what they experienced, but I also included in the book people who didn't come over under the auspices of the church. They just were put on an airplane and were, their parents bought an airline ticket and sent them over. And what happened in October of 1962 with the missile crisis was Castro ended all commercial travel between the two countries. After the crisis was over, President Kennedy adopted a whole new isolation policy and basically said, we're not going to have any interaction with Cuba, and that was the beginning of the policy we have today, the trade embargo and all that stuff. And his point was, we're cutting off all those ties with Cuba, and that had the effect, of course, of stranding all those parents who had been expecting they would be able to come over. Some of them had tickets, couldn't come. And it meant that a lot of the kids who were in the care of the Catholic Church, for example, Catholic charities, were stranded too. They were stranded in this country without parents. When the freedom flights began in '65, there was a real emphasis put on getting the parents over here. Within the first 6 months, the number of Cuban children in the care of the Cuban Children's Program, which was all the people who were paid by the government to take care of these kids, it went from 5,000 to 500. So within the first 6 months, they had 4,500 families that they were able to reunite by bringing the parents over on the freedom flights. So, yeah, an incredible story. A story that, I think in one way or another we've all probably heard, and I had certainly heard it. But I learned a lot more about it from the people that I interviewed. So, great question. Thank you.
So what restrictions were there from 1959 to 1962 on Cubans who wanted to come over? And how did they get flights out? Because my understanding is that you had to be have a passport from another country or something else to be able to get out of Cuba at that
You had to get an exit permit. They set up that requirement very early. You had to get an exit permit from the regime. So that was very early, 59, 60, and that remained in place until a couple of years ago. Raul Castro got rid of that as part of the change in relations that he and Obama were trying to work out between the two countries. So the exit permit was hated by the Cubans for that whole period. But essentially, you had to get an exit permit for the government. At first, you went and applied for it, and eventually, so many people came and were leaving that they said, well, if you want an exit permit, you have to give us an inventory of all of your property, all of your belongings, all of your possessions. And when it was time for you to leave, they checked, and everything better be there that was on the inventory, or you didn't get to go. So they did that. The reverse, on the opposite side, you had to have a visa to get into the United States. We required a visa for Cubans and so many others. And what happened in January of 1961, right before he left office, President Eisenhower severed diplomatic relations between the two countries. It was kind of, Castro had done something that was a last straw for the Eisenhower administration in terms of the way he was reordering the economy and essentially confiscating American businesses and other things. And so Eisenhower severs diplomatic relations. Well, that, of course, closes the consular section at the Havana embassy. And so people couldn't get visas to come to this country. So the State Department, relying upon the Attorney General's authority under our immigration laws, essentially began admitting Cubans on parole. We let them into the country even without a visa. And they would, on their passports, when they got to this country, the immigration officers would stamp IVD, indefinite voluntary departure. So they weren't technically admitted into this country, but they were allowed admitted as a formal legal term for their status once you're allowed in. They were essentially allowed into the country on parole. And they remained with that status until 1966, when the Congress basically, and President Johnson said, what are we going to do with all these Cubans? We've got hundreds of thousands of them. They can't go home. They don't want to go home. Many of them can't get licenses to be doctors or lawyers, or get a license, an occupational license as a hairdresser, if they're not citizens. We gotta do something about this. And so in '66, Congress passed something called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And it basically said, if you were a Cuban and you had come into this country January 1st, 1959 on, you were, no matter what your status was when you were allowed in, whether it was a student visa or a tourist visa or what, or on parole, you were allowed to ask the Justice Department to adjust your status to permanent resident. So they were given green cards. Moreover, the time they had to wait before they could apply for citizenship was cut in half. Usually it's 5 years. Under the Cuban Adjustment Act, it was 2.5 years. And so they made a real concerted effort, our government did, to figure out how to integrate all these hundreds of thousands of Cubans into American life. So it's a great story, but the different approaches that the two countries took to this mass migration are, I think, very revealing.
Do you have any plans to do a follow-up book on the Mariellas or the next wave of Cuban immigrants?
You know, I don't. They're actually, one of the complications for me was there's a Cuban American professor in Connecticut, Victor Andreas Trier, who has written oral history of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Operation Pedro Pan, and he just within the last 2 years did one of the Mariel boat lift. And so I don't think there's, and others have done that as well. So I don't think there's the need for another oral history book that covers Mariel. The difference between my book and the other books that have been done is they focused on the Bay of Pigs and Operation Pedro Pan. And my goal was to try to capture the larger experience and the different episodes that took place during those years.
Are there still policies in place to, different immigration policies for Cuban Americans coming in, like from 1980 to now, as opposed to any other nationality of immigrant?
The only one that is still in place from the past is the Cuban Adjustment Act. That is still the law of the United States. The challenge, of course, is that as part of the effort to put the United States and Cuba on a normal footing, if you will, President Obama rescinded what was called the wet foot, dry foot policy. And that was a policy that had been in place for something like 20 years that said the Cuban who was picked up at sea trying to get to the United States would be returned to Cuba. The Cuban who was trying to get to the United States and got onto dry land would automatically have refugee status. Obama got rid of that. And his point was, we're trying to have normal relations between the United States and Cuba. Cuba hated the wet foot, dry foot policy, and his point was, we're not doing that for anybody else. If we're gonna have normal relations, we need to get rid of that. So that policy's gone, and what that means is, the challenge for any Cuban trying to get to this country now is getting in and staying for a year in order to claim the benefits of the Cuban Adjustment Act. Let me just make one more point along this line. Cubans are now the #2 nationality group crossing our southern border. Mexicans are first, Cubans are second. This fiscal year, October to October, they are projecting we're going to have 150,000 Cubans coming to the U.S. across the southern border. They typically cross at Del Rio, Texas, or Yuma, Arizona. They don't cross the Florida Straits anymore. They get on an airplane in Havana and they fly to Managua, Nicaragua, where the government eliminated the visa requirement for Cubans last year. And so they're coming up through Central America and Mexico like other refugees trying to get to this country. What really drove that home to me, and it had been an abstraction for me, is when I was in Cuba in April. The day we left, we went to Jose Marti Airport, and we're passing one of the doors to get into the terminal, and there's a crowd of several hundred people, and they looked like, they didn't look like American travelers. They were carrying the suitcase, and I asked our guide, he said, there's a flight to Managua today. They're going to Nicaragua because they're gonna go to the States. That's where they wanna go. So they are in the most dire economic situation, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, and some people say it's the worst they've ever experienced. I mean, the economic, political, and social system in that country simply does not work. And people are still voting with their feet trying to get out. #2 nationality group entering our country today, Cubans. So The way to look at my book, I think, and I didn't originally look at it that way, but I do now, this is the beginning of a mass migration that is continuing right now. Right now.
And where are those people settling? Yeah, are they also settling in Miami?
A lot of them are going to Miami, yeah. A lot of them, there's a question about what's their legal status, but a lot of them are being allowed in on parole while they figure out what to do about it. I mean, it's a real conundrum. It's a real conundrum. But, you know, the Biden administration has been taking some steps to try to address that crisis, involving some adjustments in various policies that have been in place, including getting rid of some of the stuff that President Trump had put in place. And they've had new negotiations between the Biden administration and the Cuban government, because the Cuban government has certain things that they want. President Reagan made a promise in 1983 to the Cubans that we would take up to 20,000 Cubans every year. We'd issue them green cards. That was the price he had to pay to make that commitment in order to get Cuba to take back people from the Mario boat lift that we didn't want. And he made that agreement. But in the ensuing years, they never issued 20,000 green cards, despite the promise to do so. And so then the Cuban government put pressure on President Clinton in 1994, and they revised the accords and committed that the U.S. would take a minimum 20,000 Cubans per year with green cards. We don't have that kind of agreement with any other country. No other country has a guaranteed minimum number of green cards that we're going to issue their citizens. That is unique. And they were still having trouble fulfilling it, and so President Bush, George W., set up something called the Cuban Refugee Family Parole Program. Basically, we'll let those 20,000 a year in on parole before we even finish the paperwork on them. They can come here and wait for us to finish the paperwork on their green card. I mean, something else. We don't do that with anybody else. Sorry?
Not even knowing what their status is, not even doing an investigation whether they have a criminal record.
No, I think they do that. I mean, we have always done that, going all the way back to '59. I mean, the people who were allowed in on parole, they were allowed in after there was a security check to make sure they were not on the list of Cubans that our embassy in Havana had identified as people we didn't want. And they had a list, and they brought that list here when we severed diplomatic relations. President Trump eliminated the parole program. President Biden announced a couple of weeks ago he's reinstated. Yes, ma'am.
I'm interested, didn't know about this coming from Nicaragua. And those people come in legally through a visa, they're not crossing the border in the desert or anything.
They're coming much the way others are coming up through Central America and Mexico, undocumented, in terms of having the required papers to be lawfully in the United States. But many of them, it's kind of unclear exactly how they're doing. The government's doing it. I mean, because it's happened so suddenly.
But they do come to an immigration.
Oh, they come to a port of entry. They come to a port of entry, and the two ports of entry they typically come to are Del Rio, Texas, and Yuma, Arizona.
Gotcha.
And many of them are being allowed in on parole while the government figures out what to do about it.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm a teacher, and I can tell you that this year I've had I teach high school, more Cuban immigrants than ever before, and they come in. I had some even the last week of school come in, and it's in my that's a comment. And my question to you is, they are fairly well educated, don't speak the language, obviously it's my job to teach them, but all of them to the letter want to return, but we have this constant battle. Their parents don't want them to go back, and they have to maintain a certain grade point, etc. Do you see anything in the future with the way that that government is kind of devolving right now, an opportunity for these kids, because that's what they want to do. They just want to go back.
In terms of their government.
Yeah, they want to go back. The kids want to go back.
That's right. You teach here in Sarasota County. This lady is a teacher in public school here in Sarasota County, and says that just in the last year or so, she's noticed a large uptick in the number of Cuban students who are being enrolled in schools here. And she says a very common reaction among them is they want to get into a position to go back to Cuba. Is that fair?
Yes.
They want to be in a position to go back to Cuba. And you know, what do I know about that? And do I foresee any changes in the regime there that would lead to them being welcomed back? Let me make a couple of points in response to that. First, Cuban government decided quite a few years ago to reverse its policies. Starting around 59 or 60, they basically said to people who were coming into exile, if you leave, we're not letting you back. You leave, you don't get to come back. And that remained the policy until 79. In 79, they began to relax it. They began deciding they wanted the exiles to come back. They wanted them to come back with the money they were making in the U.S. And in fact, the woman I read to you from in my book, Mercedes Vandermeer Peña, was the first, if not one of the first people, allowed to repatriate to Cuba because her father was a hero of the revolution. And so she was allowed to go back in 1979 with her 2 kids, and they lived there for a year. She talks about that experience in the book. So they are now officially allowing Cubans to come back. The wrinkle is, and there's a guy in my book who explained all this to me. If you were born in Cuba and you want to go back to Cuba to visit or to live or whatever the circumstance, you got to get a Cuban passport. They consider you still part of the Cuban people. You can't go in on a U.S. passport if you were born in Havana, Cuba. They won't allow it. In fact, they announced on the plane I went down on in April, they announced that on the plane to everybody. Well, I had known that. So, one, I would imagine that anyone who really wants to go back will be allowed to go back by the regime. The second thing that I'll mention is that I mentioned a moment ago, Florida International University conducts a poll of Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County every 2 or 3 years. One of the more striking aspects of that poll is the division of opinion on a number of issues between those who came before 95 and those who came after 95. And when you look at the question, would you go back to Cuba, either to visit or to live? Those who came over before 95, very strongly against. Those who came over after 95, very open to that. Very open to that. Want to go back. They've got family. Many of them come here, and that's particularly true from what we've been seeing in recent years, to do what migrants from so many other countries do. They come here to make money to send it home to their relatives because their relatives are in dire circumstances in Cuba. And that's not something you see just in places like Mexico and Central America. It's true in Cuba as well. So,
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the process of finding a publisher for your book? It's always interesting.
yeah, it was. I knew when I started because friends of mine who had written books from my, I have a number of friends from my journalism days who had written books and gotten them published. And I hugged with all of them and asked, you know, the ins and the outs of that. And I had read some books and talked to various other experts, and they all had pretty much said the same thing. No trade publisher in New York is going to be interested in you and your book. Your best bet is going to be at an academic press. And what I discovered was that what has happened to the publishing industry, and many of you may know this, is it's become so consolidated in publicly traded companies that are creatures of the quarterly earnings reports, that they have begun, they rely primarily on bankable authors, John Grisham, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. I mean, anybody who's got a name, that's the kind of person they want for a book. And who's ever heard of me, right? And besides that, I have no credentials to on this book. I'm not Cuban American. I don't speak Spanish. I don't have any advanced academic degrees in a pertinent subject like Latin American studies. I'm not a journalist coming off a 20-year gig as a roving correspondent in the Caribbean. I mean, there was no credential that I had that would have remotely interested. So, but I thought, well, I'm going to give it a shot. So I spent about 6 months pitching literary agents in New York and Washington. Got rejected by all of them, which I had expected. I was disappointed, but I wasn't surprised. They all had this very interesting way of saying no. They said, "This is really good work. I mean, really enjoyed I sent them a sample chapter. Really enjoyed reading your work. It's really well done, but I can't sell this in New York." Now, wonderfully ambiguous for I can't sell this in New York because nobody's heard of you. I can't sell this in New York because nobody cares about Cubans. I can't sell this in New York because I'm not a good salesperson. I mean, it was just, I can't sell this in New York. I mean, it was over and over and over. So after about 6 months of that, I thought, well, okay, I gave it a shot. Now, I turned my attention to academic publishers. And one of the agents who had turned me down gave me a list of about a half a dozen university presses to pitch. And said, you can tell them I gave you their names. But before I got onto that list, I thought, I'm going to try Florida. Because that's where the market is. If anybody's going to be interested, it's going to be University of Florida. If I can't get them interested, I got to rethink this whole thing, basically. So, well, they just immediately said yes, they wanted it. The acquisition editor who read my materials, who was in charge of, among other things, Latin American studies, and was recently promoted to editor-in-chief. She's brilliant, just top-notch. She wanted the book, and so she emailed me and said, I want to sign you to a contract, which would obligate me to deliver a manuscript to them, but wouldn't obligate them to publish it, right? And I said, well, before I agree to that, I want to meet you, and I want to sit across the table from you, and I want us to talk about this. So I went to Gainesville, and we did that, and she said, nobody has ever said that to me. Nobody. And it's not like I was in a very strong bargaining position, right? And I knew that, and she knew that. But we sat there for about an hour and a half, and we had just this great conversation. Covered a lot of points. She introduced me to their marketing director. I mean, so I was sold on it. And the best thing that could have happened to me is to end up where I ended up, because this woman believed in the book. She gave me great advice. When I sent in the final manuscript, as I knew they were going to do, they sent it out to experts. And these are top-notch faculty people at the University of Miami, other places, who have written about and know the story. And they critiqued my manuscript. They went through 2 rounds of that, took 8 months. They went through several revisions based on their comments, all of which were just absolutely on target. So I ended up with a much better manuscript than I could have produced on my own, simply because they put me through that process. And they had been concerned, this guy's a lawyer, he's not going to want to do that. And I told them at the outset, no, I think that's great. It will only make, whatever I do, it will only make it better. And that's what happened. So the only disagreements we ever had, my editor and I, didn't happen until literally days after I submitted the final manuscript for them to start working on it internally. She didn't like the title. She didn't like my idea for the cover.
Is that your title and your idea for the cover, or did you go with what?
No and no. I'd gone through a number of working titles, and when I submitted it, I was calling it 90 Miles Away. I liked the 90-mile motif, and I wanted to be able to use it in a way that was ambiguous, that it was 90 miles from Havana to the U.S. and 90 miles from the U.S. back to Cuba. I loved the ambiguity of that. And I had used in the original draft for the introduction the word lifetime. And she called me up. She said, we had a big meeting about your book. We don't like the title. We don't think it captures the full story. And I said, what's the idea you've got? She said, 90 miles in a lifetime. And at first, of course, my ego was terribly hurt. So I said, well, I'll think about that. And so my wife and I talked about it the next day, and we both said, their title's better. And so I called her and I said, look, Stephanie, if you're waiting to hear from me, I'm telling you, I'm good with it. You know, go ahead and make it official if you want. And she did. Then I had a completely different idea for the cover. I had been trained as a journalist to always imagine what a finished work product would look like before he started writing. And so I had always had an idea of what this book would look like when I was finished. I mean, I could literally in my mind turn pages and get a sense of what it was going to be like. And I had ended up wanting the cover to be a piece of art by a Cuban American artist. And I went to the lady I told you about who was an art historian in Miami, and I said, I want somebody who's a Cuban American artist. I want a piece of work that depicts this experience. She turned me on to a guy named Luis Cruz Azaceta, who is in the book. He lives in New Orleans. I found out all about him, and I contacted him, and I said, I want your story. He has a great story. But I also wanted one of his images. And I pitched it to my editor and her team, and they said, well, we like it, but we think it's too abstract. We think it doesn't make the subject of the story obvious enough for someone who's just going to take a quick look at the cover, and then that's going to influence their decision to buy the book. They said, we love the book. We love the guy's art. And so they said, what if we put it on the frontispiece? I said, what's that? That is the page opposite the title page. And I said, okay, great. Now, the original's in color. When I interviewed the guy, he dragged the painting out of storage in his studio in New Orleans and showed it to me. It's a beautiful painting. It's just amazing. So it loses a little something by being grayscale. But when you look at it closely, it took me, and I ultimately came around to their point of view, because when you look at it, at first I thought the guy was holding a loaf of Cuban bread. It's not. It's the island of Cuba. And his point is, wherever I go, I carry the island with me. Those were the only two disagreements that my editor and I had, and she turned out to be right. And she actually let me pick the photograph to go on the cover. And so anyway, I had a great experience with the University of Florida Press. I really, really did.
I just want to say thank you so much for bringing the story to life.
Thank you.
It's quite informative,
Thank
and it was so interesting to listen to you because it resonates. I came here as a young child out of third grade from former Soviet Union, and
Oh,
the
did you?
similarities, of giving up. I didn't, and just understanding it because it wasn't really talked about. The concept of giving up your job for my parents, of not being able to be excluded from the society once you apply, the waiting for the permit. I mean, it just was interesting to hear, very similar story, and understand it on a deeper level. And, thank you for taking the interest. Obviously, this was a labor of love.
It
in
was,
so
very
many
much so.
ways, and very inspiring.
Thank you. Do we have time for me to tell one story?
Of course, yeah.
I'll play you off of what you said. I mentioned that there were a number of people I ended up interviewing that I didn't know they were Cuban Americans. I didn't know they had come here from Cuba. One of those is a guy named Rick Fernandez, and I write about him both in the preface and then he's in the book. And I had done, he worked for the city of Tallahassee, and I had done business with him for my clients, negotiating things between my client and the city. And finally found out he was Cuban American. So he was one of the very first people I interviewed. I interviewed him a couple of times. First interview, he was sent out in 1966 by his parents, unaccompanied, to Spain. There was a whole separate program in the mid-60s where Cuban children without their parents were sent to the U.S., but they were sent by way of Spain because they couldn't go directly from the U.S. and Cuba at that point. Rick was one of those kids. I've yet to find anybody in one of these oral histories who actually lived through that experience. So my first interview with Rick, we covered all kinds of stuff. And I remember asking him, well, when you were getting ready to leave, what was that like? Well, it was not that big a deal. He said that over and over. Second interview, I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. Second interview, I don't know what question, I went through that again. I don't know how I phrased the question differently, but all of a sudden it unlocked him. And he talked about how at the age of 12, after his mother put in papers for him to leave, he was sent out into the fields to pick cotton and cut sugar cane. 12 years old. And he said, you know, most of the kids that I was with, their parents had put in their papers for them to leave. We had to stay in some, you know, tent and sleep in a hammock at night. And, you know, 12 years old with machete, cutting sugar cane. That's what they were doing to these kids trying to leave another totalitarian country like you left. Anyway, thank you. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. So if you want to buy David's book, it's downstairs, and then of course you're happy to sign them.
Oh, absolutely.
Here.
Yeah, we'd love to.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.